Hello and welcome back to the Phoenix Files. This is our first episode of Sparks and Clashes. Today we're going to be talking about decolonization. I'm your host, Chelsea.
And I'm Jack.
So what would you say is your experience learning about or just experiencing decolonization?
Well, I think this is kind of like a very broad question. So like to situate myself in this, I'm born and raised in Latin America in Costa Rica. That's where I still live. And I come from a family of, my mother's American, my dad is mestizo Latin American. So like my experience with it is just growing up in Latin America, obviously understanding that there is a past of abuse and resource abuse, people abuse in the land, but not really understanding why or how it came about. I learned it very much in a historical, matter-of-fact way. And now we understand that colonization is not a linear thing and that it happens in different ways. It happens to the mind and it happens to the body. So I'm very interested in learning about how decolonization colonization persists today, and what are ways that we can decolonize that thinking that still persists. I don't think of it as a gradual thing or as an actual tangible thing, but as opposed to like these forces that have penetrated like conscious and subconscious bodies and minds and structures, and how are we going to work around that today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. My experience or conception of it all, I grew up in Saskatchewan, settler colonized Canada, right? Coming from settlers myself, we never really learned about decolonization in school. We just kind of learned about the history of Canada as a series of colonizations from the English and the French. And yeah, we never really, at least from my experience in my school, it was never spoken about as a process of people coming and establishing sort of their rule and their way of life. It was just sort of, this is the history, this is what happened, we have Canada now.
In a very matter-of-fact way.
Yeah.
What I would like to get to at the bottom, what I'd like to get to the bottom of today is understanding if those processes of matter-of-factness are very much that part of colonization that keep it alive, and how they like filter by osmosis into the institutions, into our material culture, and like really persist in that way. There's a reason why you as a student here, fourth year UBCL, like you made it here. You don't need to learn about it to move forward in the world, coexisting with people from many different paths of life. You can just, as a white person, you can just go through life. You never need to know about it. But
I don't have to think about it.
Exactly. For other people, it's like just their reality completely.
Yeah.
So I would just like to get to the bottom of that. Thankfully, you have a great guest to kind of help us think through those things today. I want to learn about my position in relationship to like the world around me, what it feels like to migrate to a place and adopt or kind of abandon customs, etc., and the role of violence in all of that. I'm very interested in all of that. Let's get on with it. To help us navigate these like difficult and somewhat elusive topics, we have Dr. David Jefferess today, who is an associate professor of English and Cultural Studies at the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies here at UBCL. Welcome.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for your patience. So your areas of study revolve white savior complex, colonialism, decolonization, and it can all fit within this umbrella term of like post-colonial discourse. So could you just please tell us a little bit about yourself, a basic overview of your research up to this point, and if I can add an additional question there, why you feel like you can speak on these topics to give the audience a little bit of background.
Sure, thanks. My name is David Jefferess. Like Chelsea, I'm a settler-situated subject in Canada who grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, without ever having to think about the fact that I was a settler subject, that there was a history of colonialism. Instead, we had this matter-of-fact history of Canadian becoming. And so we go and see the pioneer villages and all that stuff, which was just normalized and made acceptable. And it took me a long time. And in my university education, we didn't talk about colonization in any meaningful way back in the early 90s. So I've come to this a lot later than I think a lot of the people, that we're speaking to, a lot of UBC students. And it was a challenging learning that I'm privileged in a Canadian society as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual male. I have all sorts of kinds of privileges as a result of that I've benefited from a long history of colonialism that continues today. For me, I went and lived in Malawi for 2 years and saw a different history of colonialism and a different history of anti-colonialism and resistance against that kind of history of oppression, but saw various kinds of links. So coming back to Canada, I did a PhD studying colonialism and various kinds of resistance to colonialism. And since then, I've been active as an academic doing that kind of work, and I also had kind of, in my university days, a lot of social justice activism, anti-racism activism, environmental activism, a lot of anti-war, anti-imperial activism that I was involved in. And so those things kind of have come together over time. And so why am I the best person to speak? Initially I'm like, oh, should I take this interview? It's like, do we need to hear another white guy's thoughts on this? But I'm struck by things that you mentioned, Chelsea, that as white people, we don't know about that sort. It's not kind of visible. And I think a key aspect of decolonization is that white people have to recognize that they are always experiencing colonialism. It is not foreign to them. It's not something that happens to other people, that colonization affects everybody pretty much in the world in various ways, and white people have to begin to really learn that and take account for it. And we see how difficult that is for people, right? That even basic things like recognizing the history of residential schools in Canada. We had a moment about 5 years ago where there's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and this recognition of the horrors of the violence that happened at residential schools. And then this year, September 30th, what was the social media backlash, right? Show me the bodies. There's this resistance by white people to accept the fact that the residential schools happened, never mind other aspects of colonization in Canada. So there's an onus on people like me to speak, to learn, without taking the space of other people, to recognize, to speak from my positionality, as you were saying.
Yeah, no, I feel like that's massively important, because if I may add, but like there's this sort of sense of guilt that I feel like a lot of us white people have when talking about these issues. But an analogy that I want to draw, I was speaking with one of my friends, and it was about heterosexual cis people talking about queer and like the trans experience and queer rights. It's still a valuable discourse to have. You don't have to be a part of a community to empathize and to understand how if we're coexisting in the same space, we have to talk about these things that to some of us may be invisible, that to some others aren't. Because as you said, colonialism for a lot of white settler communities can be invisible, but is very, very much not invisible to many, many communities that suffer the tangible effects of that. And I think that now that we're in a position of privilege, we're also in a position of like elevating certain voices. It becomes quite a responsibility, I think, to talk about these issues. Like once you're aware of it, you have to sort of really tackle it. And in that now, I would like to ask you, what does colonialism look like today?
Can I just jump in really quick before we ask that question? Just on that note of like, what is our onus, like as white people talking about this? As you mentioned before, asking, am I the right person to be talking about this? I feel like there's a lot of people in that same situation. Like, for me, the anxiety, I think it is rooted in an anxiety of like, I'm going to ask the wrong questions. I'm going to come off in the wrong way. I'm going to say something offensive. I think a lot of it does come down to just not being aware. But I think most people in our position, at least in a university context, are aware. And if you are aware and you're not talking about it, then what's the reason for that? And I think a lot of it is that anxiety of saying the wrong thing and, I don't know, asking stupid questions. So in that light, to ask the very basic question, what is decolonization?
Yeah, I mean, I think to ask that, I would like, if you can speak to like, I would like to like kind of set the ground on like what is colonialism, to then address what is decolonialism. And if we could just like briefly speak to both of those, because it'll lead into the rest of the questions. And I think we need to have a good foundation of what colonialism is and how it started, but how it exists today in other ways. And I think people are going to be mad at me because this is off script, but I genuinely think that we have to address those very basic things of like, how does colonialism persist today? And what is decolonialism, and what are the aims of that? Does that make sense to you? Yeah, for sure.
I think like one thing I hope we can kind of come back to, considering my positioning as a white situated person, is that it may have been invisible and it's made invisible, and but that is part of colonialism. It's not. I experience colonialism every day of my life. And I benefited from it. And so that's a key aspect that we want to kind of talk about. It's not something that happens to other people. So yeah, the history of colonialism, the very basic kind of standard history, is that the European powers, France, Britain, Spain, Portugal, even sweet little Belgium, went around the world taking land and displacing people, whether it be Africa, the Caribbean, what is now Latin America, North America, the Turtle Island. And colonialism looked kind of two ways. One, largely exploitative, and the purpose was to take the land and to take the resources without significant settlement. And in other places, like what is currently Canada or the United States or Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, it was a project of settler colonialism, where the kind of surplus population of Europe found a place to go and create new places to live. So that history of formal colonialism ended in various places in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But in some places it is obviously still ongoing. I live in unceded Civic territory. The unceded is a very powerful term. It means that the land is still occupied. There's never been an agreement between the British Crown and the Canadian state for Canada to exist or BC to exist. So in a very strict sense, this is still colonized territory, and the Siak Okanagan people continue to assert their obligations as the true caretakers of this land. And so the Okanagan Declaration highlights that. So with that kind of framework, though, often people will think, well, colonialism ended, right? India got its independence, Kenya got its independence, Jamaica got its independence. Why are you still talking about this stuff? And colonialism, in a broader sense, continues to be the kind of ideological framework that produces a particular kind of social inequality. And it's highlighted by kind of extractivism and the idea of extracting labor and wealth and resources from people. So when we look at today, kind of struggles for decolonization are happening in a great many different kinds of ways. And I'll start very specific with land. As we speak right now, there's wide recognition that North Gaza is being exterminated. And there are senior officials in the Israeli government who have said, we want to take the land of Gaza. We want to usurp this for Israel. Israel as a state is a settler colonial state. And so the Palestinian people have long been resisting that colonial occupation. And of course they did so before it was Israel. They did it under the British colonial rule that preceded. So that's one form of colonization and decolonization, the active struggle against the oppression and occupation of land. In West Africa right now, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso have all had so-called military coups in the last few years, and the leaders have said, we want to take back our resources because our resources are largely under the control of France. They are benefiting from the wealth of gold and other minerals, and we want to take that back. And of course, France and other European powers don't like that so much. So that's one kind of area of struggle of decolonization. In what is currently Canada, there is a land back movement by Indigenous peoples that has been ongoing for generations, but certainly over the last 10 years. The land back movement is expressed in a variety of kinds of ways that seek justice for the long history of colonialism here, and a new relationship that doesn't look like the old kind of colonial oppressive relationship. And we could go to other places in the world where there are similar kinds of struggles that are happening. And I wanted to foreground material struggles for land, for access to wealth and resources, because that, I think, is the foundation to this. Then there's the cultural aspects that, as you both described, make this idea of colonial exploitation seem natural or seem normal or seem acceptable. And those cultural aspects of colonialism are things that we can also see that there are struggles against.
That was a lot you said, but I really want to go back to the idea of colonialism happens to everybody, because you're offering that perspective to me now, and it's just something that's come to my head. But do you think that is kind of placed into colonialism as like a foundational part of it, so that we don't even, like, people who benefit from colonialism don't really even sense it? It's so normalized. Yeah. Is that like a purposeful thing? Like, how does that happen? In what ways can we see that in our own lives? Like, as a white man, how do I benefit from that in tangible ways today? Because I very much believe it, but like for other people, like how does that happen?
It happens in a whole host of ways, and one of the ones that kind of struck me in one of my classes this week, but it happened many times, is I teach a lot of literature that's about people who are not like me. So people who grew up in Trinidad, or people who grew up in India, and or in Kenya, and in Kenya. So there's story after story after story of what the educational experience was like in Trinidad or Kenya or India or Sri Lanka, learning English. And you can go from place to place, and people will talk about learning English at the end of a rod, meaning that they were struck, usually on the knuckles, with a stick if they didn't speak English, or if they weren't pronouncing things correctly. And one of the things that was really profound in a class just this week is a student from a former colony, British colony, who's, I imagine, in their 20s and grew up in that country, said that was their experience. So 10 years ago, learning English in their country, if they did not pronounce correctly, there were punishments, including shaming, having to wear, signs that say, I'm a dunce, and these kinds of things. And that idea of English, so when we focus on that, it's important to focus on that violence of how English was historically imposed and continues to be. I didn't have that experience, but I still had an experience of English being presented as the universal language, as a normal language. And you gave the kind of the example of thinking about gender and sexuality. One of the things that we were talking about in the class is that English being constructed as this normal language that everyone should just learn is a highly gendered language, and the grammar is very much about dichotomies. So English traditions, things are good or things are evil, they're not in between. You're either male or female, there's nothing in between. But there's lots of languages in the world that have either one pronoun for everything, including this table, including the microphone, or have multiple pronouns recognizing different ideas of gender. So English has been constructed as this normalized universal thing when it's actually deeply cultural. And all you have to do is bring this up in a room with people who speak more than one language, and particularly people who learn English as a second language, who then can tell you stories about how English is so different than their own language. It requires them to think in different ways. And so when I say like white English-speaking people are also colonized, well, we speak English. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has part of that is a loss, right? For me, it's a discovery, and it's almost troubling to learn that there are languages that have no gender in pronouns. And that is like, it seems so strange, and I use quotation marks. And And that's a loss. It's a loss for people who don't have this other ability to see the world in different kinds of ways, to see relations between human beings and other beings. And that's one of the kind of really profound things of moving to the Okanagan for me, is sitting in rooms and hearing Syilx elders tell stories, whether it be Chaptiks or other kinds of stories, and realizing there's other ways to understand the world, and I didn't get those. And I'm only getting them now, and I'm not getting them well enough. And so there's a violence that's been done. And I think, when we look at a capitalist society and a consumer culture society and extractive society, I'm not sure I'm benefiting from that, or my children won't, right?
Yeah.
When we look at the environment and the costs of what colonialism has had, we've all been impacted in various kinds of ways.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just wanted to touch on the language aspect, and I don't remember exactly how you put it, but that the imposition of English is, like, it's also been imposed on white settler people. And just from my experience, like, I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan, like went to a school of K-12 of less than 100 students. We didn't even get to learn French. Like, most people that I know in BC at least took a different, obviously another colonial language. But as you said, has different ideas of gender. Things are even more gendered in that sense. But just that sense of, like, missing out on different ways of understanding the world, just because we live in such a deeply colonized area. And I mean, Western Canada, it's deeply colonized by the English, right? Like, not even getting the opportunity to see the world from that even just French perspective, I think is an interesting point. I've never thought of language that way before. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Also, I think it's important for, like, the people listening to this, the ability to think of the things that you do not as really a choice, but things that are imposed on us, right? So many of us think that we're choosing to do something, when in reality there really isn't much of a choice in many circumstances. So that's a thinking shift there. And I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you for that.
So yeah, just on that note of language, it's reminding me of a class that I'm in right now, Politics of Mexico and Central America. And my professor was just going over, we had an essay assignment coming up. He was just going over, like, how to structure your argument, all your topic sentences, like how to make a clean and concise argument. And then, just as sort of a flippant offhand comment, he's like, this is actually a really, like, English way of thinking. Other languages don't really do this. He and it's a class about Mexico, so he said specifically, like, when people write, even in academic settings, in Spanish, it's much more like train of thought type of thinking. And it just really, like, I don't know, I took a step back and I was like, wow, my whole way of thinking, not even just language wise, but in an academic setting, of, like, what I believe is a good academic article is so rooted in this idea of, like, English colonialism, which leads me to the question of what is colonialism in the academy, and how do we decolonize the academy?
Great. I think that example is such an important kind of one. Over the past, like, when I first started here in 2005, there wasn't much talk about decolonization, and now the university, and most universities in Canada, it's a branding thing, right? There's funding, a lot of faculty highlight that they're decolonizing, and the university even uses this, and it's almost a branding kind of thing. And it is really disingenuous for the reasons that you're suggesting, that what the university teaches and how it teaches it and how you experience that is a deeply colonial framework. And so that as the idea of the argumentative essay being the standard of how we produce and create knowledge is a very Eurocentric kind of way of thinking, and arguably a very colonial way of thinking. And so one of the questions to ask when people say that the university is this kind of leader in decolonization is, like, well, show us the examples of that. And there's more diversity maybe now in the university, in terms of, at this university, in terms of who is here and who is teaching. And there's a lot more courses that might deal with histories and experiences in various parts of the world. But is there a diversity of methodologies in terms of research methodologies? So what is the essay, that kind of argumentative essay, but other kinds of methodologies? Or, where do the methodologies come from? Well, they all come out of a particular European tradition. They all considered universal and normal, and we just follow them even though they have very cultural specific histories. Other kind of basic things is like you walk around this campus, every room has been built the same way. They all have a little podium at the front. No matter what size, there's an assumption that you're supposed to lecture in a course. And so that kind of, just that idea of having a white guy stand at the front of the room, regardless of what he's talking about, whether it's engineering or colonialism or anything, and people just taking notes and writing those notes down. That one-way kind of system of education where it's about regurgitating on a whole series of midterms. Everyone's got stress around their midterms. And a lot of it's about regurgitating knowledge, as opposed to spaces like this that are about kind of creating dialogue. And I wouldn't call this decolonizing, but when we think about what a university can do, there needs to be this kind of recognition that we need to organize it differently, to teach differently than what we are. And the university is largely the same as it's always been, but the branding around decolonization has come. And I think, the question, can the university be decolonized? No, is my basic answer. That it's an institution that can't, but you can do things within that institution that are different. You could structure it differently, and you can foreground anti-oppression in important ways. But that doesn't necessarily happen in most universities, and I would say certainly this one.
So would you say if the institution, comes from a very colonial history and still operates in that framework, are the disciplines taught also rooted in colonial history? I know I take fine arts and art history, so you don't have to talk about those. But if you're teaching to, as you said, a diverse body of students, can the discipline itself be colonized? Like the discipline of, say, not
politics.
Politics, obviously, but
I think
other creative pursuits. Is cultural studies a deeply colonial area of study?
Well,
one of the things in my third year course on colonialism and decolonization, which I always start with, we're going to talk about colonialism and decolonization, we're going to learn about it, but we're not really doing it. So there's a difference between kind of thinking and learning about it and necessarily doing it. But one of the things I asked, one of the assignments is look at your academic discipline and learn about the history of it. And so that English is one of my disciplines, and English studies, where did it start? It started in India as a way of maintaining British colonial domination. In England at the time, they were studying the classics, or for the wealthy and the poor were having to learn about religion. And they couldn't do that in India, and so that's where the literary tradition of teaching Shakespeare and other things as a way of inculcating European English cultural values and the idea of English cultural superiority, that's where it kind of began. And so English has a deeply colonial kind of history. Art history, I suspect, go down that rabbit hole. Art anthropology, political science, all of these disciplines, when you think about, and I guess one question is, whose knowledge is shared in these programs? What kind of knowledge is it? How is that knowledge created? What kinds of understandings of relationality are presented in these disciplines? And so all of the arts-based disciplines, or most of them, are deeply Eurocentric. Cultural studies, it still is, but as a discipline that emerged in the 1960s, it very much sought to be a program, a discipline that was about challenging oppression. Like anti-colonialism was at the core of it, anti-capitalism was at the core of it. Yet it still reproduced a lot of the same kinds of ideas of prestige and expertise and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm not I wouldn't ever consider myself an expert on pretty much anything, which is counter what a university is supposed to do, is produce an ego and produce an attitude of, well, I'm an expert and I know best. And so what, those kinds of processes of learning, how are those being instilled? So whose knowledge, how is that knowledge created? How is that knowledge disseminated? And I think when you start to ask those questions, you can answer the question about whether our education is colonized, still.
Okay.
And I think there's important ways that we undermine it in various programs. Like in cultural studies, a lot of upper year cultural studies classes, you don't write essays anymore. You do a lot of other things. That's not necessarily purposely anti-colonial. It's recognizing that when you go out into the world, you're not going to write a lot of essays. And so having skills in podcasting or oral communication, working in groups, those things are actually more useful. But there's a meaning to them. Like when you have to collaborate, there's a different way of understanding relationships than if you're constantly, writing just papers or regurgitating knowledge to a professor. So I'm very tentative to say anything I do is really decolonizing, but it is maybe counter-hegemonic, or it's critiquing and trying to make visible those systems of power.
Yeah. On systems of power, that just touched on something that was going on in my brain, especially with the classroom example that you used. Like I'm a poli-sci major, and it's the study of power, right? Who has it, what kinds of power there are. And yeah, with like the classroom and the lectern example, it shows you who in the room has power. And like you said, even if you're teaching cultural studies and you're teaching it from an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist sort of standpoint, if you're still operating within that power relationship, how anti-colonial can it really be?
Yeah, and exactly. And we have a university right now that's making huge budget cuts, increasing the teaching loads of a lot of faculty, which means we'll have more students, which means it's harder to do. When you have lots of students in giant classrooms, seemingly the only way to communicate is by lecture and regurgitation, right? So there's all these structural elements of how the university is constructed that limit how you can think, how you can communicate, how you can work with one another. And those are largely by design. All the classrooms were designed that way.
Yeah.
I've been here before they were built and said, don't build them that way. Build them like this. And they still built them all in the same uniform way to have this one-way communication.
Yeah.
And so, those are fundamental kind of things to think about when we want to begin to think about creating different kinds of relationships and more just kinds of relationships.
I guess
very complex. What do you guys?
Yeah. I guess my question then would be, what does that restructuring of relationships look like? I mean, obviously, I don't know if we're the right people to be answering this question, but if we were to speculate, as I think it might be important that we do, what does that change in relationship look like, and how do we have a sort of meaningful change when it comes to decolonization if these institutions are so deeply rooted in colonialism and deeply rooted in our society?
I think the first answer, considering where we are, would be to think about indigenization and Selic ways of knowing. And I'm not the person to speak about that, and I would suggest a future podcast. We have an Indigenous Studies program. There are a number of Selic knowledge keepers who are professors here, and other Indigenous professors. And I think having those kinds of conversations about what does knowledge creation and knowledge transmission look like from Indigenous perspectives, how is relationships understood differently? So I'm not going to answer, but I think it goes back to this. I think part of your question is, well, what do we do? Well, I think seeking to try to understand the power relationships that create inequalities or create injustices, and seek to undermine those and create different kinds of power relationships. And it's really hard to do in the university because of the pay scales and because of like the way it's structured. You can only, the best you can do, I think, is talk about colonialism. And then there's a danger of, like, that you're just talking about it and you're not really doing anything. But your agency is so limited to actually change relationships. It can, like, there's ways that we can do it. We can undermine the system in certain kinds of ways. Professors need to teach differently. Students need to demand different kinds of education. But yeah.
Yeah, because as we said, it becomes really, really, really complex and convoluted, and we should have.
We're not being complex.
No, it's not. But what we can determine is that we don't know what the right thing to do is, right? Like, we don't know what it looks like.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets perhaps nebulous and fear starts to creep in. So as we like wrap it up, and people have just gotten this very clear information, actually. What are some of like the key points that we would like somebody who just listened to this conversation? What are some of the key points that they should take from this, and how can they apply it to their own life when they go to school? I'm thinking when you go to school, you can perhaps think that education doesn't always look like this, right? This is not what education means. This is what it means to us. But what other ways can people start to, as you say, not decolonize their mind, but start undermining sort of these institutions? What are some key takeaways?
I think like one way to think about that, and it goes back to your earlier point about like not knowing what the right way is.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that Western education systems train is that there is one right way and there's one right answer, and we need to be experts and you need to know, which leads us down some really dead ends sometimes and can create a lot of harm.
Yeah.
And so humility is one aspect of that. Recognizing I'm never going to know everything. I always have something to learn. I always need to recognize that my experience is not everybody's experience. So I'm speaking for myself. So like humility, not as a buzzword, but actually how do you put into practice kind of recognition that I'm going to make mistakes and that's okay. That I need to keep learning. So that's one way to kind of think about it.
Yeah.
Another, I think, is an important distinction between, we've been using the term education to talk about a university, and I think a university is schooling. There are institutions called schools that are based on various forms of discipline, including punishment, or or praise, right? You either get praise or you get disciplined, kind of thing. And that schooling experience is not educational experience, that we learn in a whole lot of other kinds of ways. We learn from our elders, we learn from our mistakes, we learn from our friends and in community. And thinking about recognizing that the university is only one place that shares knowledge, and it's not the only place. And so I think making that distinction between schooling and education is a useful thing as well, because then we can validate so much of our other experiences. For a lot of people, you come to the university and all that kind of prestige that comes with getting a diploma, but the diploma means it's a piece of paper. What happens to you in these 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever years that you're here, in terms of, it is not just a classroom. So thinking about how you understand relationships, thinking about how you build community, and challenging some of the kind of assumptions that you've been brought up with. And that's, again, situated from a white perspective. It's about undermining, it's about recognizing and then trying to undermine those kinds of ideas. I think, getting away from that idea of there's a one right answer. That's not a good trap to go on. I think that there's multiple possible answers, and how do we understand those different possibilities?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that that's a great takeaway that everybody can take from this. We appreciate your time, because talking about this we consider important, like the podcast team considers it important, so we just want to appreciate your time and sharing all of that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. So much to chew on.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Don't just skip to another video. Actually think about it. Yes. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you everybody for joining us of this episode of Sparks and Clashes. we want to thank Dr. David Jefferess for being with us today, and we want to thank his time and all of his knowledge that he shared with us today. So thank you. That felt like a very fruitful and fulfilling conversation. Housekeeping, the next episode will come out on November 19th. And you can check our website, thephoenixnews.com, for any updates on that. And you can also follow the website. Oh no, JK. You can follow the Instagram at UBCO Phoenix, right? Yes.
Yeah.
If I said
Phoenix.
if I said it wrong,
TikTok
it's
and
in the
Instagram.
description below. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. I thought it was charming.